Hello and welcome to this video presented by Whitley Bay Photographic Society. In this video we're going to be looking at photographic exposure and some of the basic settings on your camera. On a camera there's various settings that we can use when we take photographs. The easiest way to take a photograph is just to keep it in auto. The camera will then do everything it needs to do to have a correctly exposed picture. You don't have to worry about anything, just point in the right direction, press a button, and that's it. On the other end of the scale, however, there's manual setting, which you have to put all the settings into the camera to get a photograph. So you have to judge everything to get the exposure done correctly. So what's meant by exposure and what does all of this mean? So every camera, it takes a picture using a sensor. On this picture here, we can see the lens has been removed from the camera and the sensor is that green thing at the back of the camera there. So for correct exposure, what we need to do is we need to get the right amount of light onto that sensor so that it can record an image for us correctly. So in order to get the correct amount of light onto the sensor, there's various things that we can use on a camera. And there's something called exposure triangle, which I'll try and explain now in a second. And there's three elements to this. The first is the ISO. And what that means, it's the sensitivity of the sensor. So at its most sensitive, it will photograph in lower lights, for example. And at its least sensitive is better for bright light. This can be altered and moved around. The next part of the triangle is the shutter speed. In other words, how fast the shutter opens and closes. And that obviously has an impact as to how much light gets to the sensor as well. And the third aspect is the aperture setting. This, you'll see in a second, I've got some photographs to show it, but the aperture is a little bit like the iris in your eye. It can be made bigger and smaller, and that again has a bearing on the amount of light which is allowed into the sensor for the photograph. All of these things relate to each other, so if you increase one of the aspects, you'll have to alter one of the other parts of the triangle to compensate. So all of this sounds really quite complicated, and the question is, why do we bother when you've got auto settings and the camera will just do everything for you? Well, it all depends on what you want to create with the picture. Now fortunately, although this sounds complicated, manufacturers of cameras, they've come up with a couple of semi-automatic settings we can use. And the first we'll talk about is the shutter priority. And in that you can control how fast the shutter opens and closes, and the camera will do the other parts of the triangle. It will calculate them itself and it will put the correct settings in. So in this first image we can see it's a shot of a pier with a wave hitting it. In this, because it's been taken at high speed, high shutter speed, you can see that it freezes the water almost, and you get quite a dramatic effect. This is high-speed photography like this can be used for sport, for wildlife, for things like that. On the other end of the scale, we've got a slower shutter speed. I think this was about 6 seconds for this one to make the sea appear quite milky. With slower shutter speeds, then that's more time that the shutter is open, so there's more light that gets to the sensor. The only problem with that is sometimes you get too much light, and for long exposure settings like this, you sometimes need an additional filter to go on your camera lens just to restrict the light coming through. So they're fairly straightforward, fast and slow, but what you can do as well, you can make things, show some movement with some of these shutter speeds. So in between the fast shutter speed and the slow shutter speed, this image was taken, and the bird, you can see with the wings, it gives that impression of movement because it is slightly blurred. You've got some motion blur in that. This is often used for things like photographs of aeroplanes with propellers, where if the propeller's still, if you take it with a fast shutter speed, it just wouldn't make sense. The plane flying in the air and the propeller's not turning. So that's another setting we can use. Another occasion where we might want to slow down the shutter speed a little bit is a night time where you haven't got the light, so you want to make more light hit that sensor. So with nighttime shots, we can take it slightly slower shutter speed as well, and this is how we get shots in the nighttime. The other thing we can do with nighttime shots, we can be a bit more creative, and we can do light trails. Again, it's just leaving that shutter open for a bit longer, and you get the trail of light following along behind the vehicles. So the other setting that we can use as well is your aperture priority. Again, like the shutter priority, with this you control what size aperture you want, and the camera will do the rest of the settings. So the question is, what is an aperture? As I said before, it's a little bit like the iris in your eye. So we see on this first shot here, the aperture is in the center of the lens, and it's blades which come together, and you get a very small aperture on this picture here. That can be adjusted, as you see on this picture, so it's slightly bigger. And again, on this picture, it's fully open. So there's various settings we can have in between those points. So why do we have the different settings with an aperture? Again, it's to do with light. It lets more light in the bigger the aperture. But the other thing as well is that it has a bearing on the depth of field. So in this landscape, we can see from front to back, everything's in focus, everything's sharp, which is what you want for a landscape photograph. To achieve this, what we do is we have the aperture quite small, and so we get more front to back sharpness. If, however, we make the aperture bigger, we get a shallower depth of field. So as we see in this image, we've got the bird in the front is nice and sharp, but the background is a bit blurred, which is the effect that we want for this type of picture. And that's just done by a shallower depth of field with a bigger aperture. The only thing with apertures, which gets a little bit confusing, is the fact that the bigger the aperture, the smaller the number. So an aperture of f22 would be very, very small, whereas an aperture of f11 is a lot larger. So that's something to make it a bit more confusing. So thank you for watching this video. I hope it did make some sense. Please remember to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're also on Facebook and Instagram as well, if you'd like to follow us on there. We are a physical photographic club, and if you'd like to have any further information on our club, please visit www.wbphoto.org. Thanks for watching. Bye.